So we are going to discuss the poetry of the age of the Pope. Uh, as we try to find out and try to study this age bit deep, bit uh, yeah, as we talk about this age and we try to find out the perspective of the literature while discussing this era, we find that this was the age where several type of literature is emerged, and it has given a numerous writers who had played a very important role in the development of the poetry of the age. Not only the poetry, but the literature of the age. In that case, we can, when we just see the features of the poetry of the age of Pope, we find that it was highly self-conscious kind of poetry, and it has different aspects which had played a very important role. In that case, I would like to talk about the first thing, that is satire was considered as one of the important aspects of the poetry in this period. Specifically, as we just go and find out, we can find that political satires were very famous, and uh, as we try to study the poetry, one of the important school of the poetry these days, that is Riyad history. Um, I'll put some points and then we discuss them uh, one by one. We can find some pastoral influence over there. Then protagonist presence of classical and authors and learning was uh, another instinct associated with poetry. Accepted the intellectual premises of the Enlightenment, a deep sense of humanism, deep sense of humanism, that is another aspect. And the most important that I would like to write down over here, that is highly self conscious. So, as we try to study poetry, uh, poetry of the age of the Pope, these are some important things which we can see. As we talk about the first thing, that is this age was considered as the age of political satire. Public and literary figures were criticized a lot. Criticism and caustic mockery, that was one of the good feature of the poetry of the age. And we can find gentle irony in this regard. As we just went and talked about the graveyard school of poetry, was another important aspect of poetry, the age of Pope, and it we can find that it talks about the decay and death specifically. Decay and death. We'll come to this point and we'll talk about poetry. As you go and try to study this age, we can find a deep sense of humanism also find in the poetry or the poetry of people who belong to this age. Specifically, we can take some names like Oliver Goldsmith, Thomas Gray, Alexander Pope, are the people who concerned a lot with this aspect of poetry, which is described by these people and written and advocated this type of poetry. Uh, as I told you, they accepted the intellectual premises of the Enlightenment and the story of these poetries were getting woven around this Enlightenment. Now, again, pastoral influence also, pastoral influence also one of the important aspects. Predominant presence of classical authors and learning, that was another stuff. um, which we have to go and find out throughout the poetry. When you talk about the poetry, we can find that according to the Hudson, one of the historian belongs to the English belong, belongs to the study of history of English literature. What he says that uh, this age is associated with the classical school of poetry by the Hudson. The product of the intelligence is the sophisticated kind of poetry of argument and criticism of politics and personalities are reflected in the poetry of the age. As we move forward, it was deficient on the side of emotion and imagination. So, while studying this poetry, we can find deficit, specifically this thing, that is deficient side of the classical school of poetry. We can find it deal with the deficient side of, on the one hand we have emotion, and the other hand we have imagination, which is advocated by the poet of the age. The poetry was revolving around these topics, and this is considered as a town poet. And why so? Why it would describe as town poetry? Any insights? because it neglects the humbler aspect of life. Neglect humbler of life. And which are these humbler aspects of life? So the first thing is nature. Nature, landscape of country and people. The things and and that's why the people wanting all in all romantic elements, okay, which were unsympathetic towards even Chaucer, Spencer, and Shakespeare's poetry. हे आपण का करू शकतो की आपण गावाकडे म्हणतो की शिकेल तितका भुकेल. ओके, म्हणून ते शिकलेल्या लोकांना जरा थोडं वेगळ्या अँगलने बघितलं जातं. तर ह्या लोकांनी पण तसंच केलं. Those who belong to this age and they written the poetry, what they have done, they neglect these things which were associated with the soil, country life, country man, and they were too unsympathetic to the Chaucer, Spencer, even Shakespeare's poetry. When we try to find out their forms and their style of writing, we can find they have some extreme devotion to form, a love of superficial polish, highly artificial and conventional style of writing. So, extreme devotion to form, that is important aspect. Extreme devotion to form, a love of superficial polish, highly artificial and conventional style, some important aspect. For example given is Godrej is shown to eternal blazing on shade attain. Later, an empathetic protest by Wordsworth has been, and that's why we can find the rise of closed couplet as the only possible form for serious work in verse. That's why they embrace this closed couplet. Grew monotonous in the long run, too narrow and inflexible, we can find. So, who are the representative poetry? The first one is important aspects of his poetry. As we try to study Alexander Pope, one of the greatest poet of the time, he's the one who had played an crucial role in the development of the poetry of the age. He was born in 1688, and his time frame is from 1688 to 1744. Best poet known for his satirical verse as well as his translation of Homer. He is famous for using heroic couplets. His second most frequently quoted writer in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotation after Shakespeare. Pope was born to Alexander Pope Sr., who was a linen merchant. He is Catholic, so his education was affected by Test Act. So you might have heard about this Test Act, which upheld the status of the established Church of England and banned Catholics from teaching, attending a university, voting, or holding public office. So this is a kind of restriction we can find. Initially, he was taught by his aunt and later went to Catholic school. In 1700, his family moved to Popeswood because of strong anti-Catholic sentiments and stated preventing Catholics from living within 10 miles of either London or Westminster. Series. Okay. Pope described the countryside around his house in Windsor Forest. Windsor Forest was one of the important work written by the Pope. He educated himself by reading Horace and Juvenal, the epic poet Homer was in English authors as Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Dryden. Pope had a close attachment with Lady Mary Wortley Montagu and also had lifelong relationship with Martha Blount. The translation of Homer brought Pope a financial independence and became first professional poet. Then his famous work, The Rape of the Lock, is dedicated to John Carlyle. The first major work of the Pope is the Pastoral. He was removed from the society as he was a Catholic, but still he had achieved whatever he wanted to. Okay. In May 1709, Pope's Pastoral was published in six parts of Townsend's poetical miscellanies when he was only 16 years old. In 1711, he wrote Essay on Criticism. Don't confuse with Essay Criticism by Matthew Arnold, but Essay on Criticism is the different one. His friends were Tory writers, along with whom he formed Scribblers Club in 1713. And they are John Gay, Jonathan Swift, Thomas Parnell, and John Arbuthnot. The aim of the club was to satirize ignorance and pedantry in the form of fictional scholar Martin Scribblers. He also made friendship with these Whig writers Addison and Steele. So, even though they were not what we can call it, they don't have share the same thoughts, but still they became a friend. Whig writers like Addison and Steele and the Pope. He translated Iliad of Homer. Jonathan Swift called Pope as a paper-saving Pope. Pope could fix in one couplet more sense than I can do in six, that is by Dr. Johnson. He has written a pamphlet on Shakespeare called Shakespeare Restored. One of his important work is on criticism. You might have studied it in um, your criticism lecture, but have a look on it. It is written in three parts. He took 3 years to complete this poem and published in 1711. This poem was an attempt to identify and refine his own positions as a poet and critic. The poem is a response to a question of whether poetry should be natural or written according to predetermined artificial rules inherited from the classical past. Pope exhorts his fellow poets to follow nature. Pope comments on the classical authors who dealt with such standards, and the authority should be aggregated to same as per him. We know it is very famous work. So I'm not going that much deep into it. These are some important quotes from it. One of the famous work of the Center Pope is here, that is Rape of the Lock. Those who have studied English literature in a bit sense, they must have an idea about this work, The Rape of the Lock. It is mock heroic narrative poem first published anonymously in Linton's Miscellaneous Poems in 1712 in 2 cantos. It is also the example of high burlesque poem. It was expanded and reissued in the edition written by Mr. Pope in 1714 in 5 cantos, accompanied by 6 engravings. So finally it was in 5 cantos. The final form of the poem was available in 1717 with the addition of Clarissa's speech of good humor. The poem was based on actual incident recounted by Pope's friend John Carlyle. Arabella Fermor and her suitor Lord Peter, from Catholic families who suffered legal restrictions and penalties. Peter, lusting Arabella, had cut off a lock of her hair without her permission, and the consequent argument had created a bridge between the two families. Pope added the second edition, dedicated later to Arabella Fermor. Pope has used this supernatural machinery in this poem. So this is one of the best example of the city poetry. This is the plot of the poetry. So as we all must have an idea, I am not going that much deep into it. So let me just go and talk about the Pope's important works. Pastorals was an important work by him. Pope's pastorals were among his first published poems, appearing in the sixth part of Jacob Townsend's Jacob Townsend's poetical miscellanies. It offered an idealized view of the country life, molded on Virgil's pastoral. The second one is his Masiha poem, which deals with the Virgil's fourth eclogue, which was said to predict the birth of Christ. Windsor Forest, as I told you, Pope's first political poem, which celebrated the rule of Queen Anne and the peace treaty of Utrecht. Windsor Forest, a famous royal hunting ground, functions as a metaphor for political life of the nation. Poem dedicated to George Granville, Secretary of War in Queen Anne's government. George Granville. Peribathus, we can see in front of us, an essay that is parody of Longinus on the sublime. It ridicule contemporary poets. It has subtitled The Art of Sinking into Poetry. The main aim of this poem is to ridicule contemporary poets. It is parody of Longinus on the sublime. In this poem, Pope introduced the term bathos. This essay illustrates the lowest version of contemporary verse, the tendency of bathos and anticlimax, drawing upon his enemies as example. One of his famous essay on man, philosophical essay written in heroic couplets, that is concerned with vindicating ways of God to man. Pope's argument in the essay derives in part from Bolingbroke's fragmentary philosophical writings. It compares four epistles addressed to Lord Bolingbroke. These are: first one, of the nature and state of man with respect to the universe. Second one, of the nature and state of man with respect to himself as an individual. Of the nature and state of man with respect to society. And the fourth one, on the nature of and state of man with respect to happiness. So these are the four different parts of an essay on the man. This poem assumes that the man has fallen and must seek his salvation. It consists of four epistles that are addressed to Lord Bolingbroke. In this, the poem says that no matter how imperfect, complex, inscrutable, and disturbing the universe appears to be, it functions in an irrational fashion according to the natural laws. Walter called this work the most beautiful, the most useful, the most sublime didactic poem ever written in any language. Another famous work by him, that is the Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, 1735 is the publication year. Poetic is epistle addressed to the writer and physician Dr. John Arbuthnot, defines nature of right action as opposed to wrong. Also contains satirical portraits of Joseph Addison under the name Atticus and Lord Harvey under the character Porter. Sorry. It is an introduction to the Imitations. It reviews his own career and includes the famous portrait of the Lord Harvey as Horace. Ah, you might have heard about the Dunciad. The Dunciad is a poem celebrating the goddess Dullness and the progress of her agents across Britain. The first version Pope's target of attack was Lewis Theobald, who was replaced by Colisiba in 1742-43. again we can find a kind of counter attack over here, as he just attack the writers like Lewis Chobot, policy buff in his work. That is the idea. There are some works written by Alexander Pope, and as you know, he is no doubtly one of the famous writer of the age. We can't deny his contribution to the English poetry, and he's the one who had played a very important role in the development of the new classical poetry. The next person in front of us, who is considered as the father of graveyard of poetry. I have a look on him, and then we'll discuss the graveyard school of poetry. So, as you just try to find out the age, we can see this. we were talking about the Graveyard School of Poetry, where Thomas Gray was considered as one of the important practitioner of these kind of writing. Just see this and then we'll discuss. As we talk about the Thomas Gray himself, he was born in London and was educated at Eton College with Horace Walpole at Cambridge. Uh, Gray began seriously writing poems in 1742, mainly after the death of his close friend Richard West, which inspired sonnet on the death of Richard West. Uh, yeah, in 1747 he wrote the poem Ode on the Distant Prospect of Eton College. Was an important writer of the Pindaric Ode. Okay, so even though he has written such kind of poetry, he was considered as one of the important writer of the Pindaric Ode. His entire fame rests upon a single small volume of poems which are divided in three periodicals. The first one is first period was Ham to Adversity, Ode to Spring, Ode on the Distance Prospect of Eton College. Second period was the Progress Poesy, Pindaric Ode, the Bard, Pindaric Ode, the Elysian Country Churchyard. That's one of the um, famous, or let's say one of the distinct kind of poetry, that is the Elysian Country Churchyard. Third period, the Fatal Sisters, the Descent of Odin, and the Candidate. He was offered the post of poet laureate in 1757, but he refused. Altogether, he wrote only 13 poems in his life. Walpole writes of him, he never wrote anything easily but think of humor. He is also known as a graveyard poet. So, what is graveyard school of poetry and what is graveyard poet? So, graveyard poets are characterized by their gloomy meditations on mortality, skulls and coffins, epitaphs, and worms elicited by the presence of the graveyard. Moving beyond the elegy, lamenting a single death, their purpose was rarely sensationalist. As the country progressed, graveyard poetry increasingly expressed a feeling for the sublime and uncanny and an antiquarian interest in ancient English poetic forms and folk poetry. Graveyard school of poetry was considered as, or not considered, but we can recognize as precursor of the Gothic literary genre as well as Romantic movement. They are also called churchyard poets. The major writers include Goldsmith, Parnell, Gray, Cooper, Macpherson, Robert Blair, Colin Chatterton, Thomas Percy, Thomas Warton, and Mark Akinside. Yeah, let's move and talk about elegy written in country churchyard. began this masterpiece in the graveyard of St. Giles Parish Church at Stoke Forbes in Buckingham in 1742 and completed in 1750, published in 1751. Uh, Elegy written in a country churchyard is one of the most popular and most frequently quoted poems in the English language. May be written on the death of his best friend Richard West. It includes famous phrases as far from the madding crowd. It quotes novel of Thomas Hardy also. The unlettered muse, a youth to fortune and fame unknown. Celestial fire, see the pun, okay? Full many, full many a flower is born to blush unseen. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen. The path of glory leads but to the grave. It is supposed that Gray found inspiration of writing this poem by visiting the gravesite of his aunt Mary Arthbus, who is buried at the graveyard of St. Giles Churchyard. It is written in quatrains, and the last three stanzas are printed in italic type and given the title The Epitaph. It is written in quatrains, and the last three stanzas, as I told you, it is written in a churchyard moves from a meditation in a particular place upon the graves of the poor to reflection of the mortality of all humankind and on some of benefits of being constrained by the poverty. Here are several lines which I would like to recite for you over here. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowering herd wind slowly over the lake. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. A curfew means ringing of bell in the evening in the church. Important lines of the elegy: the boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth ever gave, await alike the inevitable hour, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. म्हणजे जे आपल्याकडे वेदांत फिलॉसॉफी आहेत ना की ज्यात सांगितलं जातं की सगळं जे आपण इथं सोडून जावं लागणार आहे जे काय आपण करतो ते सगळे आता त्या भाषेत सांगायचं झालं तर कर्म आपल्याला थोडं वेगळं वाटेल पण हीच गोष्ट आपण याच्यात बघू शकतो की तर तेच सांगायचं की द path of glory leads but to the grave. That is the things which Thomas Gray want to tell you through his poetry. and the writers associate with this age, but I think we have to go with the other writers. As we move forward and try to find out the writers who belongs to this cult of the poets, we can see that after Thomas Gray, there were several writers who also had played an important role in the development of the English literature. They have, as we're discussing Graveyard School of Poetry, these people, they were obsessed with melancholy or despair, an English melody, we can say, the elegy, a common form, concerned with human mortality, decay, aging, and death, and they were anticipated to Gothic novel, which I have already told you. The Anatomy of Melancholy was written by Robert Burton, and these people were, frankly, we can say that they were inspired by these Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Thomas Gray's elegy written on the country churchyard we already discussed. Thomas Parnell's Night Piece on Death, that was another important example of the Graveyard School of Poetry. Edward Young's Epic Night Thoughts and Robert Blair's The Grave. These are the important precursors, or let's say the practitioners of the Graveyard School of Poetry. Other important verse writers associated with this age, that is John Gay, who had famous for his trivia. A travesty of the Beggar's Opera took the town by storm. William Somerville, The Chase. Sir Samuel Garth, this Dispensary. James Thompson, The Seasons. James Thompson, The Season was is considered as one of the important poetic edition of this age. John Dyers, this Grongar Hill was greatly admired by the Wordsworth. Mark Akenside, The Pleasures of the Imagination, that was didactic aesthetic theory we can find to this. In that case, we have this John Gay's stuff in front of us. Have a look into it. And we will discuss. John Gay is famous for his The Beggar's Opera. All of us have an idea about it. We need not to describe it again.